Welcome to How Good's Innovation Online series. I'm Ethan Soloviev, the Chief Innovation Officer at How Good, and I'm very excited to be joined today by Junjo Lee. We're going to focus on the anthropology of food, which I honestly had never heard of, didn't know anything about until I met Junjo many years ago. So I'm excited to dig into that a little bit and explore with all of you. The overview outline is we're going to do a little intro. Junjo and I will speak for 35 minutes or so, and then we'll go into some little interactive community breakouts. So you will get in a room with one or two other people and chat and say hello and say what you found interesting and generate some questions. And then we'll come all back together after just a couple minutes to ask questions to Junjo, which you can put in the chat or come on live and ask. Then we'll finish before the top of the hour. I want to draw your attention to some upcoming events in the series. We're going to have a particular focus. It's like a mini series coming up that's going to focus on product innovation, product and recipe innovation. And so we have leading thinkers from the product development space, Heather Cutter from Harmless Harvest, Pierre Thiam, who's actually been on our show before, is an amazing chef, founder of Yolele Foods, and Fabricio Goulart, who is an amazing Brazilian chef who won a global prize recently. He's created a banana ketchup from upcycled regenerative bananas, and is just a lovely individual. So both chefs talking from a chef's perspective, and then Ali Bouzari from Pilot R&D, which is a very top-notch boutique product development firm doing some of the most interesting ingredients and sourcing and supply systems work. So they're all coming up, and there's a couple other exciting ones to announce in this product innovation mini-series. So if you're in the food industry or would like to be, or know folks who are, then we'd welcome you to this series along with anyone you want to bring. I will return us to the anthropology of food and say, welcome, Junjo. Thank you for joining us. And maybe if you'd be willing to share a little introduction to yourself, some of your path to get to where you are, and maybe a little bit of what is the anthropology of food?
Yeah, hey, so good to see you, Ethan. So I am here in San Francisco in my bedroom, and I am a food ethnographer. What is a food ethnographer? It's really trying to understand people and culture through the back door of food. And I've been doing this for a while. So I studied medical anthropology, and the person that I was studying, the healer, was an acupuncturist in Korea, in Seoul, Korea, and was really, really fascinated by his ideas, his paradigm, and the fact that this was during globalization, like strong globalization in the early 90s. And he was an acupuncturist, a constitutional acupuncturist, and I wanted to understand him, but also understand myself, because you might say that I am a product or feature of globalization. So I was born in Korea, came to the States with my parents when I was very little. Korea was rapidly industrializing, and my parents were scientists, and then went back to Korea and grew up in Korea and just kept going back and forth. And so I really, really wanted to understand this Dr. Kwon and his constitutional acupuncture. So I found medical anthropology as a way to understand him. But really, his healing modality began with food. And so I ended up migrating to food. And then I needed a job. And I found this awesome marketing consumer research company called the Hartman Group in Bellevue, Washington. And that's really where I truly started to, that's where I got my PhD, you might say, in food anthropology, by practicing.
So can you give us a little, like, I don't know, some tangible example of some of the stories or insights that maybe you've uncovered through
Yeah,
understanding humans through food?
through food. Yeah, it's so interesting, right? Like food is so much of our identity. And my first encounter with food was through shaming, actually. So I started kindergarten in Palo Alto, and kids would make fun of my food, like kimchi and seaweed, and the fact that I didn't eat normal food. And so food is so much part of our early identity. But what I did at the Hartman Group was applied ethnography. So we would try to understand consumer desires and behaviors, but also really, really what we were doing is unpacking what fresh meant for the consumer, because fresh is always a moving target a little bit. And so one of my very first project at the Hartman Group was for Frito-Lay, and they wanted to understand good food value. And I think this is kind of interesting for you, Ethan, for how good.
Very much.
So yeah, and so the process of doing applied ethnography for brands is we have a recruiter finds talks to probably 10 times as many people that will actually see, 10 to 20 times. And then we go and spend some time in people's homes, just a little slice of time in their homes, maybe even going shopping with them, sometimes even observing them cook. And what we're really doing is listening to their narratives around food. And when you ask questions around what is fresh, then you start to unpack the meaning of fresh, the symbols, um, and right, because fresh is actually, I mean, what is fresh? It's actually a signifier of how good. And so that was my first project for Frito-Lay.
Amazing.
Unpacking highly processed. At the time, people were talking about factory food and highly processed foods and high fruit. This was even before high fructose corn syrup became a thing. And so we created this spectrum from highly processed to minimally processed foods, and showed Pepsi, who owns Frito-Lay, how to communicate minimally processed and fresh. So that would be an example of what we did.
It's so fascinating, especially the spectrum aspect of it. And I'm curious if there are other spectrums that you work with that was sort of a freshness spectrum. How Good sometimes looks at a spectrum that I would call from the degenerative all the way to the regenerative, with like a sustainability in the middle. Sometimes we look at it, in terms of labor and labor risk in a food supply system, or we look at greenhouse gases from the highest emitting to the lowest emitting on a spectrum. So I'm really curious about this idea of spectrums and where else you have seen them or worked with them in your journey to understand people. And there's something else that comes to mind with that, which is spectrums to understand people, but then to what end? Like, how do you, when you're working for Pepsi or Frito-Lay, it was to do one thing, but how do you choose the sort of end that you're working on and towards?
Yeah, that's a really complex question and lifelong journey. So I could tell you. So what we were understanding was the American marketplace, the American consumer, very broadly, and our job was to simplify patterns. And so fresh was always key. But a few other spectrums that we studied for the industry was the spectrum of health and wellness. So what does health and wellness mean for people? We also studied sustainability. What is sustainability? All the way from the basic definition of sustainability, meaning something that sustains my body, all the way to deep regenerative practices. And actually, actually, when the first company that, or the first association that funded research was that I did in sustainability was the Farmers Cooperative. So the National Farmers Cooperative funded the very first sustainability study, and when we studied it back in 2007, most consumers were unfamiliar with the word sustainability. Sustainability was actually a business term. And so it wasn't part of their everyday vocabulary, if you can imagine that, right? People had to look it up. They actually went and looked it up to talk to us. So health and wellness, sustainability, and then the world of food also lies on a spectrum from very peripherally engaged. So not so, people who are who like eating familiar and tasty foods, all the way to people who food is a political act or a cultural expression, deep, deep, deep in the world of food. So those are a few other spectrums that we studied.
Fascinating. Yeah, the food as a cultural act. It's amazing. I grew up in sort of a what you would call orphaned family in a way, culturally, right? We were white middle class in the U.S. We had some connection to my Irish ancestry or my Eastern European Jewish ancestry, but the food we had was sort of, you might say, general hippie food, a little macrobiotic influenced. I also got made fun of at school, but it was because my lettuce was very green. They said your lettuce is moldy, and it was just not iceberg lettuce. So I don't think I didn't get food as culture much in my growing up. A little bit, we got like potato latkes at Hanukkah or something like that. So I'm just very interested in what you said there about food as a cultural act. I'm curious if you could, I don't know, say some more about that from your experience, or if you see that happening more now than in the past. Are there companies that are working with that and seeking to make that, a thing where they didn't before? Very curious about that.
Yeah. Well, can I ask you a question, Pat?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Please.
So when I start an interview, I always have a question that I ask, which is, and I'll ask you. So, hey, Ethan, growing up, if you could use all your five senses to think back to a memorable food experience growing up, can you just grab one and describe it using all your senses?
Amazing. I mean, that one is front of mind right now. The smell of the oil, the potatoes in the pan, the potatoes go down the plate and they're crispy but hot inside. And then there you get sour cream, you get applesauce, all these things that applesauce I love from apples. I had an apple tree in the backyard. I remember climbing the apple tree and picking the apples. And so all of that, I didn't get to connect with cows. I would have loved to have met cows and see where the cream comes from, but kind of all of that coming together in an individual meal at a celebratory time. I mean, it is almost one of the earlier food memories that I have.
At a celebratory, so can you just be more specific around a round table? Who was there?
Square table, mother, father, brother. Yeah. And it's very interesting. I started out by saying I didn't really have cultural food connection, but what I'm describing to you is a cultural food connection to that, ceremony in that particular part of my family that kind of, I don't know, is alive in me to this day. Fascinating.
Yeah. So for me, like just all the that food memory, I have so many places I might go to discover who you are and to discover your lineage and what you think about what you think is good and how you know what's good to eat, which is my question. So I love that the question that I always ask is encapsulated by your organization, How Good. So the question that I'm always curious about is, how do you know what's good to eat? and good in all its complexity and nuance and layers and orders and paradigms. That's what I'm curious about.
Right, that's
But
sort of your
can I ask
end.
you one more question?
Yeah.
Okay, so using all your senses, can you just think about a recent memorable food experience and describe it?
Um, so recently cooked outside around the fire because it's COVID and you can only have people over. It's outside, cooked over the fire, a stew that was beans that I grew in my garden, given to me by a very important teacher of mine. These amazing ancient southwestern beans combined with pork from a friend who's just up the mountain, has an agroforestry pork system, and I was cooking it not just for myself, but to feed all the people who had come around, for that time and event.
How many people were
I was
there?
10-ish.
10-ish. And what was the event?
I think it was actually connected to and planning for something that we do in our orchard. I'm a farmer. I have a 30-acre apple orchard, and something that happened that we do every year is we do basically this is an ancient English countryside Celtic festival where you go out into the orchard and you sing to the trees and you pour out hard cider for them, and you put little pieces of toast on it, and there's these funny old wassailing song, wassail, or then you hear it in Christmas songs, as you here we go a wassailing among the trees so green. And there's actually an old ancient tradition called the wassail, where agricultural peoples would go out and bless their crops and say, please, bear fruit this next year. Please grow grain. Please, they would go into the barns and sing to the cows, please have milk. And so we were trying to figure out in a stumbly, funny way for ourselves here how to make that happen again in our orchard.
That's so beautiful. So for me, like I'm listening and you're revealing so much of your worldview, not just about food, but how you relate to your body, to your community, to your lineage, and to your work. I mean, it just like so much information is embedded there. And that's what I mean by food as a cultural act. And some people have much deeper, richer cultural acts, and some people have very functional ones. So sometimes, typically, we would pay hard cash to go speak to consumers, representative consumers, and these consumers would represent different demographics that our clients were interested in. So in the demographics, generally socioeconomic, and then are they a buyer or not buyer? Are they someone who you want to become a buyer? Are you trying to grow your buying node and expand it? One of my fun projects I did was for 7th Generation. We did a lot of consumer research just at the time that they wanted to expand their market beyond just the hardcore green people to just consumers who appreciated higher quality products. And so it was really interesting because at some point, sustainable attributes became part of higher quality. And so really this fresh is a symbol, a signifier of higher quality. So what we were studying was higher quality in the marketplace and how people read higher quality and what it meant. And then companies would take that and then help in their innovation and advertising, marketing, branding process. But yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. This seems so much deeper than your standard market segmentation, assessment, demographics, psychographics. And I don't know, could you speak a little more to like the differences between what you're describing, this deeper ethnographic exploration and sort of that more standard business approach to understanding the consumer?
Well, I don't know about you, but consumer packaged goods have been studying their consumer for years, and they are really, really good at understanding their consumer. I mean, so frankly, they are amazing at understanding their consumer or their buyer node. So I actually think that I'm just describing the tip of the iceberg of what it takes for a global consumer packaged food company in terms of their research. So their research and innovation. Actually, I did a presentation for Nestle Purina. It was in the middle of nowhere. It was in the middle of it's where toilets are made in Wisconsin. It was nearby. I forgot the toilet company, but really, it was in the middle of nowhere. It was a compound with guards and barbed wires, and this is where they did their animal research. So I think they wanted to keep it a little bit in the nowhere. But it was a group of product innovation R&D, and they knew so much about animal but human physiology and research and digestion and microbiome. And so actually, I would say that these companies are good. They have their market reach because they are deep, deep in. It's just that when products come to market, if they're looking to appeal to a large market size, and often they would call them stomach share, for example, in the food world, they want more stomach share. Then you have to start collapsing that complexity and knowledge into something that is scalable, which I think is carbohydrates with flavoring and branding messaging. So just because their products are like one dimensional doesn't mean that behind these companies, they hold a lot of information and knowledge. Yeah.
That's a very fascinating that they're seeing, they're maybe getting the steps and yet somehow collapsing in some of what's delivered. I'm curious to look and ask from a slightly different angle. And this is partially because I saw there's a book sitting down behind you there, to ask this more from a community understanding, a community empowerment, community uplift, again, around culture and food. And yeah, especially how you've thought about that, how have you worked with that, your publishing company, Readers to Eaters. Yeah, just curious to hear a bit more about that and how you've taken this approach, but with sort of a different group that you're holding in mind and working with.
Yeah, thank you for that question, because we don't want to end there. So actually, so I have my husband and I. My husband comes from publishing, children's book publishing, and I come from food world. And so we created a publishing company called Readers to Eaters, and we publish books about food for children. And that actual decision holds a lot of where my aim is now. And a lot of it is because of the work that I did. So actually, it wasn't the last project I did, but where I started to have deep, deep cognitive dissonance was a project I did for, again, Pepsi. It was a Gatorade project, and they wanted to target young athletes. And so that meant 4-year-olds to 17-year-olds. And that was the project that just broke me, and I couldn't do this anymore. So I had to somehow find my way out of this ship that I was in, a safe container. And it took some time to jump ship. So I left the Hartman Group, and now I have one client. So I'm the food ethnographer for Google. And that has actually provided such amazing different ways for me to operate in my skill sets. But so Readers to Eaters. So what I realized was we've got to start young, and we have to. I became hyper focused on kids. So birth to 35, like the age where people have babies and they're babies. And I'm hyper focused on that age. And as one friend who works in the flavor and fragrance industry said, we just don't exercise our sensing muscles, our taste muscles, because it's all been sort of collapsed into uh, additive fragrances, colorings, and flavors. Actually, he said to me very rhetorically, so who makes better burgers, McDonald's or Burger King? Rhetorical question. And he said Burger King, because Firmenich, my firm, supplies the flavors. And that just got to me. I was also doing a project for Starbucks. They have a juice line. So right when high pressure pasteurization started coming out, we started, and their whole juice line, we did a project. And I remember I was in Atlanta interviewing someone, and he said, hey, look, I grew up rural South. McDonald's was actually a special occasion event. My mom was single mom working, but I had this opportunity as an exchange student to go to somewhere in rural France. It wasn't even Paris. And I had this awakening. People were talking about their food, like where the milk came from, the cheesemaker, the wine, and suddenly food started to become technicolor, kind of the way you describe your food culture, Ethan. And he said, yeah, when I was growing up, no one talked about food. Like food wasn't something you talk about. And I think that's the flattening of our food culture that had happened over the years, where food is not culture. It's just something you put in your mouth. It's stomach share. It's a chore to be done with. And so, and that just gave me this idea. I want kids and parents to know how to talk about food. And so in all the books this is our latest book, The Thing About Bees, Love Will Conquer Fear. But in all our books, we try to put in sense words to help kids articulate, like give them food words. So I think the more we talk about food and share food, and maybe if it's even sharing food ideas or sharing food culture, I think it helps. And so that's where I'm pouring my energy towards, is helping kids reconnect to food through their own bodies and sense and their family cultures. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and it works. I could tell you, my daughter, that book and the other one, Chef Roy Choi, those are still some of her favorite books. She got them, more than a year ago, and she keeps going back to them because she likes to hear about the food and the kimchi and the special sauce. And it's like, it's just very, it works. I can tell you from direct experience, it works. I want to ask one more question before we do some little breakouts and have people connect, which is to, you talked about in that little story adding complexity to food culture. It was sort of flat, but then it opened up. It became more technicolor. And so that realm of sort of diversity of food and food cultures, there's also motion in the larger food industry right now around a move to diversity of a different type, which is biodiversity. Or is it really a different type? I don't know. But there's this push towards biodiversity, as if biodiversity is separate from cultural diversity. So I'm curious if you've walked in these realms at all, and yeah, just some of your thinking on biodiversity and how that relates to the growing and the complexifying of cultural diversity that you're wanting to invite into kids and older.
Yeah. It's a really, really curious question, diversity. I live in San Francisco, and San Francisco, you might say, is a city, a place that is in some ways sourced by diversity. We have diversity of microclimates. We have diversity of trees. I just did a tree walk with this tree guy in San Francisco, sftrees.org if anyone's interested. And just realizing we have trees growing in San Francisco from all over the world, from tropical climates all the way, to Australian, South African, uh, uh, Russian, Chinese, China, Korea. Like it's all here in this awesome, just so textured and layered place. And I'm just sort of thinking about diversity right now a lot. Um, and I haven't. So there's a there's a there's a word in Korean which is 손맛. 손 means hands, and mat means flavor, and it is food flavored by relationships, really, because in every handmade food, in all our hands, literally there's a diversity that enters through the microbiome that's all attached, the microbes. And then, just all the diversity that comes on plant material and food ingredients that we're mixing together, fermenting, cooking together, all the way to, cultural diversity, biome diversity, regional, bioregional diversity. I mean, there's so much mixing that has always happened. And right now, I'm just sort of grappling with that idea. And another Korean term that I just love, which is Shinto Pul-i. And so Shinto Pul-i means, Shin means body, To means earth, Pul means not, and I means two. So earth and body are not two. And I'm just sort of grappling in that space between earth and body and what that possibility might mean. So, I know, and I do a lot of DE&I. We've collapsed diversity into a thing, an identity, something, a political act, like DE. It's an acronym, DE&I, right? We need more DE&I. I've been on these panels where are the diverse people, like, and people showing up in strange, awkward ways like that. And so I can't answer your question because I am just starting to more deeply explore it. But if I might just say, I just finished the manuscript for my next children's book, and it's about, we have a title. And we've been working on this book, my co-author and I, for 2.5 years. It's called Sandra Katz and the Fizzy Funky Wild.
Oh, amazing.
It's about fermentation and its regeneration. Its fermentation is regeneration for generations. And one of the ideas we have there that Sandra loves is shifting from consumer to maker to teacher. So that maker, I think, is really important. But also, Sandra talks about the perpetual brine. So when I did a workshop with him in Middle Tennessee at the sanctuary there, he had this big, like, Pepto-Bismol colored, because red cabbage, brine, and he called it his perpetual brine that he had learned in China, where you take out, for pickle, and then you constantly add back new. And so taking and adding back and sharing, to me, earth is somewhat of a perpetual brine. So we're starting to get at some concepts of diversity through a children's book that way. So that's
wow. Thank you. Amazing. That's such that gave my little orphan question a more beautiful place to sit, even, and way for us to hold it and think about it, the perpetual brine. So thank you. I'd love to, there's one question that I'll ask, but if you have a question, you want to drop it in the chat, that's great. I would appreciate that. Junja, there was a question here, and again, you please choose what makes sense for you. There was a question about your work with Google. Is there anything you can share or are willing to share? And if not, that's totally fine. We'll move on. But I noticed it was a question here.
Yeah, of course. So Google is like just amazing. I met them at the very first Menu of Change conference that was co-hosted actually out in Massachusetts at Cambridge. hosted by CIA Culinary Institute, which is near you, and also by Harvard School of Public Health. And they were pulling together food that was healthy, delicious, and sustainable. And that just was sort of the sweet spot for me. And that's how I met Google. And Google offered me the opportunity to leave what I was doing, which was basically symbol and language analysis, so that the food industry could just sort of understand how the narrative of food was shifting in America. And it just didn't feel right in my body anymore. So I was able to leave. So I spend my days pre-COVID talking to Googlers and really trying to understand their food life. And now I have opportunity to actually do real ethnography. So I'm able to stay with uh, Googlers over time as they have their first child, their second child, go through COVID, go through promotions, and just truly, truly understand the culture. And so right now, what we're trying to do is understand how work designs are changing, the way in which we work, live, and play it's all changing radically. So I believe food is culture. And so food at Google isn't just a perk. It's not just about entitlement. It's not, just about feeding, but it's really about creating the culture, helping to support the culture at Google. And so yeah, just deeply understanding how work lifestyles are changing and what new kinds of food experiences can support that change. And so that's what I do and I love. And I've been doing a lot of Google Meet interviews right now. And I'm going to start I'm going into Asia right now. So we're trying to understand Google campuses in different COVID levels. So some that are fully opened, like China, some that are semi-opened, and some that are in the same state as the US. I'm just trying to understand those shifts in culture.
Amazing, thank you. If anyone else has questions, again, put them in the chat. There's another one from Justine here that's asking a bit about working with smaller organizations, perhaps not the larger sort of enterprise scale food companies, but smaller food companies. And is the work similar? Is it, I don't know, yeah, just some of your experiences from that perspective.
Yeah, so I did a project for a very small company. They made salad greens, and it was really, really interesting. They made salad greens, the box salads. And so when you were speaking of iceberg lettuce, it was very interesting because when you go into the store, you can see how salad has transformed over the years. So there's the iceberg lettuce section, but then you start getting into the bagged salads and then the boxed salads, right? And then of course, and then there's the salads with the dirt on it at the farmer's market from just a huge diversity. Like I just had orak, but ancient spinach, just delicious. So you can see the whole sort of transformation of what salad meant in the US that way. But this was a company that had, they were hydroponic. Everything was created in controlled environments, and it was their green play. So they set up in climates that were cold to bring salad in sustainable ways to climates that couldn't sustain lettuce growing during the winter, fall, spring months. And it was really interesting because they're big, so they couldn't say they were organic, right? Because it's hydroponics, so very different system. And so they thought by saying they were local that would be the Trump card, but people still got stuck on organic. Also, somewhere in their box design, it said, please wash before enjoying. And the organic ones said, triple washed. But we know that like commodity organic salad greens, they're triple washed because they have to wash off the organic pesticides, versus this one didn't have any pesticides naturally, never used it. But consumer perception was, oh, the organic greens triple washed, cleaner and more convenient for me because I don't have to wash it. And, the whole washing, drying, spinning, that was just one less step they wanted to deal with. What I also learned was, so we would start in the store, meet the consumer in the store, then go home, they would prepare it, and then they would taste it, and I would taste it. So I could understand how they were experiencing salad. And what I realized was most consumers never tasted the salad mix without great dressing, without seasoning. So clearly the company that I was, Bright Farms is the name of the company that I was researching for, they actually had a superior tasting product. But a lot of consumers, their signs and symbols for understanding good salad greens was that it was dry and crisp. And so almost like confetti, very tasteless almost, but nobody was tasting it. Everybody was just tasting the dressing. So one example of a small company.
Fascinating. Yeah, there's so many little layers and insights that it seems like, any stage of company could be learning from this. And I don't even think, it's wonderful if you get the opportunity to work with Junjo Lee to do this work, but it sounds like there's methods in what you're explaining that anybody could do with with a customer, with a friend who's also a customer, to actually experience it fully and see and understand. That's, yeah.
It's kind of hard though, Ethan, because friends won't tell you the truth because people don't like to hurt people's feelings. And then there's actually, and then there's the recruiting. So being able to do it, and we did it in multiple marketplaces in Chicago and DC. So it's good if you're setting up these studies to do it in multiple markets. Don't talk to friends. Don't tell them that they represent your, most people don't want to, they're nice. They don't want to tell you stuff. And a lot of it is just to hang back and to observe, like deeply, deeply observe and listen. Just one other example, just a friend, but Farmer's Fridge in Chicago, they do these beautiful jar foods, salads and other things in jars, and they have a dispensing method. It's like a vending dispensing method. And it was really interesting because we were, and they also had it in Chicago, Whole Foods at the time, their salads. And the founder and I were standing in front of the salads display at Whole Foods in Chicago. And this woman, like clearly we were in her way and she was trying to like reach and grab his salads. And so she ignored all the salads salads made by Whole Foods. And so I started asking her questions, and she literally could taste the freshness of the salads that he had prepared because it had been prepared overnight, and just the quality. But she could also taste the quality of the ingredients, the balance of what was in there, just the care that he had put into the products.
Thank you. Question here. What's your recommendation for someone who wants to make change in the food system? What are areas that you think are exciting, or where would you send us? How do we make change in the food system?
Yeah, so it's I don't even know what the food system, like we talk about the food system. I don't know what that is actually. I'm very confused by the food system. I'm also very confused by change. So I'm not trying to be, I'm curious about the change, and I'm curious about the system, and I'm curious about food. But I don't know how to answer that question with those 3 words put together. I don't know. I'm sorry. That question is, it's generic. That question is so generic, I can't even begin to answer it. I'm sorry. If you want to ask a more specific question, I'm happy to try it.
Yeah, and Justina, we can take off mute if you actually want to ask a more specific one, but I'll just call out, there is something there that I find really important in our work, is that figuring out what specifically am I working on and who am I to be working on it, right? And or who am I at How Good to be working on it will actually pop up a different route to change for me than a generic answer to that question. So there's something about understanding who I am, who the company is, and what exactly we're aiming at that actually shifts the path a bit. So do you want to ask a more specific question?
Yeah, thank you, Ethan. So yeah, sorry, by intent, I did it a very generic question, but I'm happy to define further. I'm particularly interested in growing local food systems right now with a special project that I'm working on. And I think, you know, being in California, so much food is grown around us, but then it's not accessible often to many people. So specifically around, you know, changing where and how we source food is what I'm.
Oh, we somehow lost you again, but I think we got enough there. Junja, did you get enough there to go on?
Yeah. Local food systems and how we source. So, okay, I'm gonna just try to respond with some stories. There's a woman at Google. She works for the food team now for my client, and she, you might know her, Ethan, Emily Ma. She used to work at Google X, and she now works for the food team at Google or with the food team at Google. And for Emily, she shared a story with us about how her father grew up in China. And it's really interesting because we're Chinese, like when I interview people from China, they are just a generation and a half from knowing starvation. But her father almost died because wasn't getting enough food. And someone, a neighbor, like saved her rations, her eggs, and gave it to her father, which is how he lived and came here and then had her. And so deep within her, I think there has always been this notion of how do we reduce food waste while sharing it, making it available to everyone. So how do we redirect waste to food? Nourishment, yeah. How do we change waste into nourishment for all? And so she's working in that area. And so very much it's so deeply part of her essence and who she and her story. And so I think that's how we find the work. For me, growing up biculturally between 2 cultures and trying to really understand myself as a colonized, globalized, person, I just naturally was drawn to culture and to anthropology and ethnography. So for me, I work in the realm of culture and meaning and helping people understand. And so I think we all have our unique paths, and it comes deep inside our own essence and some stories maybe that we have about ourselves.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, we're kind of wrapping up. Oh, so that's an interesting one. How do you measure success of the programs or the projects or work that you do?
Well, for children's books, I measure success of a product in awards. So we get awards, which actually what awards represent is that more librarians, teachers will order them, expose. So, our books aren't like popular books. We don't publish books about farting, or those are popular, right? but so our books have to get noticed by educators. And so success is when a book gets noticed. And for me, my happy spot is talking to kids. So I get invited to talk to kids in schools, and I love that. So I would measure success by that, how much engagement we have after a book is published. And whether our small business, so we have a small, it's just me and my husband with a lot of partners, if we can be financially sustainable. And then my work with Google, it's really about, how helpful I might be in helping, like, sort of untangle some knots and create a little bit more understanding and care. So it's kind of that's how and if they renew my contract the next year, that's how I measure success. Yeah.
What is thank you so much, Junjo. What is one last thing you'd like to leave us with to go back out into the world a little more aware of food ethnography, food anthropology?
Yeah, I think just to always remember that food is it's living, and it happens within culture. So yeah, it's not just about ingredients, it's not just about products, it's not just about farming or agriculture, but food is delicious, it's nourishing, it is and to think about how we might nourish modern hungers, I think, is, how might we, in all the complexity and different ways, nourish modern hungers.
Thank you, Junjo. Really appreciate it. Thanks to everybody, and look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Bye.
Bye.